Hi, everybody. Today, I want to talk about how to use sources effectively. And there are a lot of issues that go into using sources. So I'm going to break this up into multiple lessons. Later on, we're going to be focusing on citing your sources. But before you even get to how you cite or where you explain where the sources came from, which is citing, it's really important to have kind of an understanding of why you're using sources and how to blend them effectively with your own writing. So the first reason, first thing to think about is why do we use sources? And the number one most important is as evidence for your claims, specific facts or expert testimony, research studies, those kinds of things. You can also use them to summarize an important theory and argument, maybe to explain some key terms, important background information. We're going to be getting to dealing with your opponent's arguments, but sometimes you'll often cite a source or introduce a source that's disagreeing with you and give their reasoning and explain how they're thinking in preparation to attack it. So you set it up by quoting the opponent. Either in the introduction or conclusion, you could use a nice quote that kind of captures something important. Impressing your teacher, of course, but really the main reason, the number one reason, is that you're trying to use evidence. Think of it this way: you've got opinions, you've got your thesis. Here's your opinion, and that's supported by your reasons, which are also kind of general statements. But backing up those reasons is evidence, facts. And you may have some facts that you can use, maybe from your experience, but really your experience is very limited. So you need bigger than that, and you need sources to get facts that back up those reasons. And that's ultimately why you're using sources. So don't use sources to cite people's opinions or generalizations. Those are going to be you're making the opinions, you're making the generalizations. You need the facts to support that. Now, the only exception is if you've got some expert who's done a lot of research in something, and it's something that you can't really explain. You're talking about quantum physics or something, right? Well, it's too complicated. Just give the generalization by the expert, right? Or if there's a conclusion to a research study by a scientist, you can quote that opinion or generalization. But basically, that would be the only exception. If you're citing like common knowledge, general opinions, don't cite sources for that. You can put it in there, but don't use your sources for that. Topic sentences, thesis statements, those are generalizations. Those are your opinions and claims, general claims. Don't use sources for that. State them yourself. You're stating your opinions. Now, take a minute to read these quotes and decide whether those are good use of a source. Should I use that as a source or not? Take a minute to pause the video and evaluate these. So number one, we cannot always avoid stress in our lives. No, that's kind of common knowledge. It's a generalization. No, we don't need a source for that. Now, you can put that in your essay, it's fine, but don't use a source for that. Number two, this is a good use of a source. This is getting information. It's explaining a theory by Freud, and it's general information. It's summarizing a broad range of theory from Freud. Number three is also a good use of a source. This is a specific fact. This is something you don't have access to, so this is what you should be using your sources for. Number four, not a good use of source. Again, that's kind of common knowledge. It's a generalization. That's your own opinion. Now, put that in there all you want. Again, same with number five. You wouldn't use that. You wouldn't use a source for that, but you could put that in your essay. Those all make sense in essays, but not as a source. Number six, yes, you're citing kind of an expert's, conclusions based on his research. So that would be a good use of a source on number six. So next thing, talk about why to use sources. Number two, how to use them. What are ways to use them? And there are a number of ways: direct quotes, blended quotes, paraphrases, summary, and they're just picking particular facts and data. So let's look at each of these. So direct quote, here's an example of a direct quote. You'll notice that it begins with a signal phrase. According to Benjamin B. Leahy, you don't always have to use a signal phrase, but this is a very common way to lead into your source. We'll be talking about that later. Notice the punctuation. Before I go into my quote, I'm going to use a comma and then a quote. And then at the end, I'll put a period and then a quote. Now, if you have a parentheses to say where the source came from, like a parenthetical citation, then you're going to put the quote first, then the parentheses, and the period goes at the very end. Okay. Make sure if you use a direct quote that it's accurate. And the other thing is to avoid overusing direct quotes. A lot of students just use all direct quotes. It's not a very effective style to constantly use these. Save the direct quotes for very special occasions when the writer's saying something that you can't possibly say better, and they say it very succinctly. And a very effective way that would do this. Or if it's something you don't even really can't explain in your own words, yep, then you can use it. Otherwise, use some of these other methods. Blended quote. This is a very nice style. It mixes your language with the source. So here's our original quote. Our cognitions are intimately linked to our reactions to stressful events, and a number of effective methods of coping involve cognitive strategies. So this would be a blended quote, because the way we think is, quote, intimately linked to our reactions to stressful events. Leahy points out that we can deal with stress by changing how we view the situation. This is a very elegant technique. It helps you take ownership of the material. It's your sentence structure, your sentence with the source plugged in there as needed. Another thing you could do is just completely paraphrase. Just do the whole sentence in your own words. Original quote, 3 effective coping strategies involve changing how we think about the stressful event, focusing attention away from stressful events that cannot be changed, and religious coping. So this would be a good paraphrase. According to Leahy, we can deal with stress by changing our perspective, refocusing our minds, or appealing to spiritual beliefs. Now, notice again, I have the signal phrase. This is also acting as a possible citation. We'll talk about citing in a minute. But notice this is my own sentence structure. This is totally, it's the same ideas, but with my own sentence structure. A bad paraphrase just substitutes words. It's the same sentence structure, but we're just paraphrasing. We're just substituting. We went through a thesaurus and we just put new words in. 3 successful coping techniques involve changing how we contemplate the stressful event, distracting attention away from nerve-wracking events that cannot be changed, and religious managing. Terrible, terrible paraphrase. It's just popping words in and out. You can also summarize large sections, okay? According to Freud, there are several ways that the ego protects itself from stressful threats, which are called defense mechanisms, and include displacement, sublimation, projection, reaction formation, regression, rationalization, repression, denial, and intellectualization. So this covers a huge body of Freud's work. This is like a massive, to get this, to read all about this, you'd have to read many, many books by Freud. But this covers a whole range of things and succinctly explains it in a very, very brief way. Make sure it's accurate. That's really the crucial thing. You can just pick data. Approximately 330 million people live in the United States. Just take that fact didn't come from me. So I have to cite it. I'm gonna have to say where that came from. I'm using a source, but I'm just putting the fact in there. Okay, just using a number percentage. Okay, so those are good ways to use sources. Now, a couple of important rules with this. Make sure you choose relevant information. Don't drop a bomb. I'll tell you what that is. Try using a source sandwich. I'll show you what that is too. Use a signal phrase to lead into the information. Don't put the title and publication information in the signal phrase. Use good verbs and watch your punctuation. So let's look at each of these in a little more detail. So first of all, choose relevant information. Here's a good use of a source. One of my favorite techniques of dealing with stress is to immerse myself in sports. This can help because it helps refocus my mind off the stressful situation, which, according to Leahy, can be associated with less depression and better physical health. It's connected right there. Bad use. There are many ineffective ways of coping with stress. According to Freud, the ego possesses a small arsenal of defense mechanisms. What is that? An effective way? Ineffective way? How's that connected? I don't see the connection. So you got to make sure it's clearly relevant. And you may have to explain how it's relevant. So put the connections in there. I mean, maybe these two sentences are connected. I don't know. But the writer's job is to show that relationship or connection. And if it's not clearly connected, it doesn't belong in there. Don't drop a bomb. Drop a bomb means just dropping a quote in. There are many negative ways of coping with stress. It appears that many individuals cope ineffectively with stress by using tobacco, alcohol, and other drugs to soothe their emotional reaction to stress. One way that I try to avoid is excessive eating. It's just, we just dropped a quote in there. Very ineffective. Better would be to use a source sandwich. So you set this up with your generalization. Begin with a general statement, then you put your source, and then you comment or follow up on that source in some way. Here's what the source sandwich would look like. A common technique for dealing with stress is sublimation. That's my own generalization. Now I'm going to use my source. According to Freud, sublimation involves reducing the stress of prohibited impulses by converting the impulses into socially approved activities. And then I follow it up with a comment, an explanation of how it fits my thesis, an example, a transition into the next section, some kind of blending or connection. So for instance, when I get angry with my boss, I exercise vigorously, translate my energy into something productive and healthy. Don't simply rephrase the quote. That's one of the really common things I see people doing is they just basically restate what that quote was. I can read. I don't need you to tell me what the quote said. I need you to show me the relationship with either what came before or what's following after. Second is use a signal phrase to lead into the information. This is typically going to be the source's name. Use the last name or the first and last, but never just the first name. Don't say, well, Mary said this. Give the source's credentials. How do we know that the source is worth listening to? Try using an appositive. I'll show you what that is in a minute. This is especially important when the source is an expert or a reputable organization. If the source, so in other words, I'm saying, here's why you should pay attention to this. This is why you should believe me on this, because this source knows what he or she is talking about. If your source is not an expert or a reputable organization, you shouldn't be using it. So that's the other thing to think about. Only use sources that are reputable and credible. If you're just going to, Joe Sixpack on his personal blog said this, well, that's a pretty useless source. So that's a good sign that you should not be using that source. Don't put the title of the article, the place of the publication, all that other information in the signal phrase. Just focus on the author's last name or the organization's last name, the organization. Here's an example. So this is from The World Might Be Better Off Without College for Everyone by Bryan Caplan. And we've got this little thing here. This does not mean, however, that higher education paves the way to general profit, blah, blah. When we look at countries around the world, a year of education appears to raise an individual's income by 8 to 10%. So here would be my use of the source. According to Bryan Caplan, 2018, an economics professor at George Mason University, a single year of education raises an individual's income on average 8 to 11% worldwide. So I've paraphrased that information. I've got a signal phrase, Bryan Caplan. I've got the credentials for Bryan Caplan right here. The first time I mention Bryan Caplan, I'm going to give those credentials. If I cite him again, I'm not going to give that same. I don't need to give all that information. By the way, this is my appositive right here. This an economics professor at George Mason University. That's called an appositive. Oops, sorry. And that explains who Bryan Caplan is. This 2018, this is part of the citation for APA. We'll be talking about this later on, so don't worry about it for right now. But this signal phrase can function as a citation as well. Not always, it's not always going to be the citation, but it can. Now let's take a little different situation. Now, I use this here like this. Notice Bryan Caplan's not telling us where he got this information from. But in this case, Kaplan is telling us that it came from the US Department of Education. So here's my question for you, all right? What do I want to put in my signal phrase? Do I want to put Bryan Caplan in my signal phrase? He's the author. Or do I want to put the United States Department of Education in my signal phrase? Think about that for just a minute. Pause the video to think about it. Give your answer. The answer is you want to use the US Department of Education. Why? Well, that's the ultimate source of that information. It's also a reputable organization. And so that's what I'm gonna use in my signal phrase. A study by the US Department of Education found. That's a signal phrase right there, telling you where the source came from. It's reputable. Now, when we come to citing, you're also going to have to give your citation. So I'll put Kaplan 2018. That's this. So is the signal phrase, go back here for a minute. Here, the signal phrase and the citation were one and the same. I told you where it came from. He's reputable, and this is the year of publication. So in this case, though, sorry, the signal phrase is one thing. It's telling you that it's a reputable source of information. This is where that information came from. And then Kaplan 2018, this is where you can find this information. This is the author. So if you want to track this down in my works cited page, you can find it under Kaplan. That's where you're going to find where that is. One more thing is make sure you use good verbs. A lot of writers just say says. This person says, this person writes, this person, you know, okay, those are kind of boring. Number one, they also don't really tell us your attitude toward the author. Okay, let's say you agree with the author. You think the author is right here. Use a word like observes, points out, notes, demonstrates, proves, reports. Notice all of these kind of indicate that they have a connotation that these things are true. Not only they said it, but it's true. On the other hand, if your opponent's saying things, use words like claims, implies, insinuates. These tell us that somebody said it, but I don't believe it. So that's something to think about too. So use good verbs. Pay attention to your use of sources. It's really important that you set them up and use them effectively. We'll be talking about citing coming up. That's important too. Before you even get to citations, you've got to have a good reason to use your sources, an effective style of incorporating it, blend it nicely with your own writing, use signal phrases, and use some good verbs to lead into it. Okay, take care.